Welcome to the third podcast of Constitutional Cappuccino, the wake-up call to the Constitution and the ideals it espouses. My name is Frank Caprio. I'm going to be your host. Today's topic is the Constitution. Now, that's a huge topic. I could take many hours talking about this. Today, I'm going to focus on its creation, the history behind it, why it was created, and the purpose behind our Constitution. To get started, realize that in the colonies, the American colonies, that there was various forms of government that were implemented. King George and his ministers had control of some of the key spots, governorships. A lot of the judges were under the control of the king. So they kept the colonists in check. One of the many reasons that the colonies decided to declare independence from Britain. But just realize that there was some existing government. Then on July 2nd, when we decided to finally announce our independence, to make it official, not to announce it. And yes, I said July 2nd. July 2nd, in our Continental Congress, they introduced the Lee Resolution. And it was read and it passed on July 2nd, and it says, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. This was the start of our revolution, July 2nd. Of course, on July 4th, everyone knows of the Thomas Jefferson-inspired Declaration of Independence, which announced to the world why we were separating from Britain. But realize that the actual official statement was the Lee Resolution, July 2nd. Now, part of that resolution, the last of the three statements, the plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for consideration and approbation. That was the start of the Articles of Confederation. Now that took quite a while. November 15th, 1777 is when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. And now a little bit about the Articles. They were just it was just an agreement between the sovereign states to certain functions that a newly formed federal government would take care of. A newly formed Congress, actually, would take care of. There was really no parallel to what we see today. There was no judiciary. There was no president. It was just the Congress being vested with certain powers. And as we saw throughout the war and even after the war, the Articles of Confederation were basically a failure. They did not give enough authority to the central power to perform the task that it was given. The states were required to pay money to this federal government, and they weren't, or they weren't paying their full amounts, or they were lagging behind. It was and there was no mechanism for the Continental Congress to get paid. So basically, that and a lot of other things with paper money in the states, and there's quite a number of things that were not going right in the colonies under the Articles. That enough good men got together and said, "Look, we got to do something." So they met a few times. One of the later meetings was in Annapolis, and they didn't get representation from all the states, but they had 6 or 7 states, I believe, represented. And they couldn't really do anything, but what they did was made a plan, and that was to make a really concerted effort to get a representative or get representation from all the states to meet together to amend the Articles of Confederation. That meeting was planned for Philadelphia, and there was a lot of wrangling that went on behind the scenes, but that is the Constitutional Convention that we hear of today. They originally met, now remember, they originally met to amend the Articles of Confederation. James Madison and a small group of men realized that the Articles of Confederation were insufficient to the task of running a country. And so Madison especially, they came up with a plan, what he dubbed the Virginia Plan, which would be a new constitution for the United States of America. Realized that the Virginia Plan was not what we consider our Constitution today, but a lot of it is based off of what Madison put forth in Virginia Plan. Bicameral House That's the Senate and the House of Representatives. He had a judiciary. He had a presidency, and I think actually, there were some differences. I think his presidency was a tribunal, like three men, not just one. And I mean, like I said, a lot of things were different, but the basis for what we see in the United States government today was for Madison. A little aside is that Alexander Hamilton also had a plan. He was a very well-respected man. He fought in the war, a war hero. He was very smart. But he's being praised by a lot of people today, and I don't think they really know the real Alexander Hamilton. His plan, and I don't remember the name of his plan, but his plan was highlighted. A couple of the big highlights were, first of all, there was an appointed president. Now, the president was appointed by elected representatives, but he was appointed for a lifetime term. He wanted a constancy of power, so you could have vision, so you could have direction. Like I said, Alexander Hamilton was a very big fan of the Parliament and of the monarchy structure. He saw the problems with it, but he thought we could take care of it in a representative form of government. The other big thing that he proposed in his plan was a federal veto on any state law, basically giving the federal government powers over all the states, making them subordinate to the federal government. Now, like I said, Hamilton was a war hero. A lot of people liked him. So they listened to his plan, which took up most of a day to listen to. There was very little debate on it, and the next day when they came back to start anew, they just kind of ignored what Hamilton had said. They didn't really want to get into it. He didn't have any support for his plan, but again, they respected the man enough that they didn't want to make him look bad. So they just continued on. Just like I said, a little bit of an aside for all the people who I see a lot of Hamilton memes and posts, and I see him on the $10 bill, and if his plan would have been implemented, it would have been so nice for what we consider the United States of America today. And so, what was considered, I mean, even to today, probably the wisest collection of politicians and political scientists ever put together in a room. They came up with a plan. A lot of haranguing back and forth, arguments, people walking out, people coming back in. They came up with our Constitution. They passed it, and then it was sent to the states for ratification. They didn't want to set the parameters for that ratification. They left it up to the states. So the states, every one of them actually, created a ratifying body that were appointed or elected people that would review the Constitution and make the vote for the state, yay or nay. Realize there was nothing that allowed any one of the states to make any changes to the document that was put in front of them. It was simply a yay or nay vote. What did happen, though, invariably with all of the state delegations, is that they wrote some notes at the end. They all ended up ratifying it eventually, but every one of them had notes on things they would like to see changed. And let me tell you, the political climate back then, they had just been through a war. There was a lot of camaraderie. So even though they had differences, the people trusted men. So what they said was, look, we're going to ratify this, and a lot of them said that they wanted a Bill of Rights. There was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. It was just the body of how to set up the government and the powers delegated to the federal government from the states. There was no mention of a Bill of Rights. There was debate during the Constitutional Convention about a Bill of Rights, but that was shot down. They voted on it. They said no. I did talk about it a little bit in the Second Amendment, but basically the argument against having a Bill of Rights was that if you list the rights, then the government gets to define those rights. And the example I made before was of the press, that they should make no law infringing or abridging the rights of the press. And that's all good and fine, and so we don't want to abridge the press, but who is the press? What does the word press mean? That means you give the federal government the power to define what press means. And then they can start infringing. If you have people that are in Washington that want to do harm, that want to use their political capital to benefit themselves or friends or theirs, they can use that to actually infringe on the rights of the press. And I mean, every other right is like that too. The right to bear arms, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to trial by jury. All of these can now be, because they're written down, they can now be interpreted by the federal government. That was the biggest argument against them. But what was found out during the ratification process, when these delegations met, now realize also these delegations were meeting, but there were papers. This was the talk. Like when we had the O.J. Simpson trial, or, whatever other, when the shuttle, the Challenger shuttle went down, that was the talk. Well, the talk for years, for a couple of years during the ratification process in the United States was of the Constitution. Everybody had it. Farmers, coopers, blacksmiths, Fletchers, bar owners, lawyers. Everybody was talking about it. It was the topic. And I mean, there's a lot of divisions. It's a great story to read if you want to read about the ratification debates. A lot of great stuff came up. But like I was saying, that all of the delegations wrote down a list, and a lot of them dealt with a Bill of Rights. They all wanted to see a Bill of Rights. And so what happened was the Constitution was passed, and that was in 1791, I believe. Yeah. And then, anyway, so I'll go with 1791. Whether it's right or not, we can figure out later. So we had a Constitution, but we had no Bill of Rights. And Madison, one of the people in the Constitutional Convention, who spoke out against including a Bill of Rights, during the first Congress that met under our Constitution, he was the one that actually proposed a Bill of Rights. In between the time that the Constitution was passed out of the convention and during the ratification process, and even before that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had a fairly robust correspondence going. When Jefferson actually read the Constitution, his first reaction was, we need a Bill of Rights. And so he convinced Madison. And so what Madison did was go through every one of the delegation's notes, and he identified all of their wants and their proposals and wrote them all down. And then he condensed those down into 12 amendments to the Constitution, our original Bill of Rights. Presented those to Congress. And he was a very eloquent man. He had a very good cause on his side. And every representative had been hearing from their people. Even the people who supported the Constitution as it was written, a majority of those people still wanted a Bill of Rights too. So a Bill of Rights was a very popular idea. And so they determined to act on that. So they sent the 12 amendments out to the states. This was an Article 5 convention. This was a poster child for it. They sent out 12 amendments to the states, 10 of those were ratified, and we had the Bill of Rights. So, what did we get? We got a compact. A compact is a fancy word for a contract between sovereign powers. One must remember that when I say the word states, in today's vernacular, that is equal to the word countries today. The states back then, they called Great Britain the state of Great Britain. Delaware, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, these were all completely autonomous units. They did everything that they needed to do for themselves. They had standing army, or the militia. They made all of the treaties. They passed justice within the confines of their state. They were individual countries, and that has never changed. So when we got the Constitution, that was 13 individual countries coming together saying, look, we have certain duties that we feel would be better for a federal government to perform. For instance, a treaty, the treaty power. If you wanted to make a treaty with a country, then with the federal government you make one treaty. If it's 13 separate states, then you have 13 separate treaties, and those treaties could contradict each other. They could actually make acrimony between the states. There can be all kinds of problems that could be created. So they decided that it's best that if you have one federal government make these deals, then it'd be best for all of the states. So the Constitution is the definition of what our government is supposed to be. Article 1 deals with the Congress, and in Article 1, Section 8, that delineates all of the powers that are given to the federal government. There are a few ancillary tasks that the government is given, not aside of this, but realize that all legislation originates in the Congress, and they gave the Congress a specific tasks in Article 1, Section 8 of what they were allowed to do. Now realize again that the powers that were delegated to the federal government were originally handled by the states. There was nothing new that was created for the federal government to do. It was merely the states saying, we're delegating this power to you to do this for us. The other key concept to realize is that because this is a compact or a contract, there are certain rules that are applied when you interpret it. One of the biggest rules is called the meeting of the minds. With any contract, there is an original intent to the contract, and anytime there is a discrepancy on what the contract says, you go to the meeting of the minds to see what the original intent of the people who wrote the contract meant to say. So that means all of the documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, Federalist Farmer, Brutus, all of these people who wrote all of these articles, they are all relevant. The other thing to remember in contract law, too, is the contract is read as a whole. So, when you're talking about specific parts in it, that part has to flow with the whole. So the general overall belief of our Constitution is that we wrote a document to actually create a federal government with specific enumerated powers. Those are the only powers that this federal government has. If they do anything that isn't within those powers, it is by definition unconstitutional, and it is wrong. And to determine if something is unconstitutional, you have to go back to the original document or to supporting documents that talk about that subject. And let me tell you, there are hundreds of them, and they lay out a clear picture of exactly the type of government that was being formed under our Constitution. When interpretations of interpretations of interpretations take us so far away from the original meaning of the Constitution, those interpretations are no longer valid. If there is a rule, a law, a regulation, a statute, whatever, that is in contradiction to the Constitution, it is by definition unconstitutional and has no force of law. This is a simple idea. It's an idea that we've forgotten about, and it's an idea that needs to be reinvigorated. Regular people can understand what is in the Constitution. It has a plain and simple meaning, and when we deviate from that, then we see the results as we do today. So in summary, what is the Constitution? The Constitution is a compact between 13 sovereign states which created our federal government. It enumerated the specific powers that were delegated by these states to the federal government. Included with the Constitution is the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. The rest of the amendments are also part of it, but the Bill of Rights in particular describe rights which are inherent to us, which the government has no proper authority to infringe on. So that's what we got with the Constitution. Nothing more, nothing less. I hope this has been informative for you. There are definitely, as you're listening to this, there are definitely many more topics within this topic that I can get into, and I will in other podcasts later. But I just wanted to lay a basis so everyone's on the same page as to exactly what our Constitution is, and by example, what it isn't. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. This is Constitutional Cappuccino, the wake-up call to the Constitution and the ideals it espouses. My name is Frank Caprio, and I hope you have a great day. And now I'll finish with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion."